The gunshot that killed Martha Oakes's husband echoed through the canyon on a Tuesday morning in June of 1878, and by Wednesday afternoon, the whispers had already started in Montana City that the widow would have to sell her ranch before summer's end. Jessica Oakes stood at the freshly turned earth of her husband's grave, dust settling on her black mourning dress, and felt the weight of 23 years pressing down on her shoulders like the Montana sun. She had loved Thomas Oakes with the desperate affection of a girl who married at 17, but their 6 years together had been marked by one devastating truth that now seemed crueler than ever. She could bear no children, and the ranch he had built with calloused hands would die with him unless she found a way to keep it alive. The funeral attendees dispersed like tumbleweeds, offering hollow condolences that meant nothing when measured against the reality of a woman alone in territory where land meant everything and a barren wife meant shame. Jessica walked back to the ranch house with her sister-in-law Margaret, whose pointed silence spoke volumes about what she thought Jessica should do. Margaret had never forgiven her for failing to give Thomas an heir, had never understood that the failure carved a hole in Jessica's heart deeper than any canyon in Montana territory. "You will sell, of course," Margaret finally said as they reached the porch. "A woman cannot run a cattle ranch alone and without children to pass it to. What purpose does it serve?" Jessica turned to face her, the afternoon light catching the auburn in her hair. "Thomas built this ranch from nothing. I will not sell his legacy to the highest bidder because the world believes a woman cannot manage what a man created. It is not about what you can manage, Jessica. It is about what is proper. You are young still. You could remarry, start fresh somewhere else. And tell another man the same truth I told Thomas, that I am broken inside, that 3 different doctors confirmed I will never carry a child." Jessica's voice cracked despite her determination to remain strong. "Thomas knew before we married. He said it did not matter. But I saw the disappointment in his eyes every time another year passed with no infant's cry in this house." Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Then sell the ranch and use the money to secure your future. You could open a boarding house in town, something respectable for a widow." Jessica watched her sister-in-law climb into the wagon that would take her back to her own prosperous ranch, 15 miles south. As the dust settled behind the departing vehicle, Jessica stood alone in the vast silence of her property, 160 acres of Montana grassland stretching toward mountains that pierced the sky. The cattle lowed in the distance, and she realized with sudden clarity that she had no idea how to manage the herd, how to organize the autumn sale, or how to repair the fence line Thomas had been working on when a spooked horse threw him into a rocky ravine. She had one ranch hand left, an elderly man named Pete who had stayed on more out of loyalty than financial incentive. He approached her now, hat in weathered hands, his face creased with concern and something that looked like pity. "Mrs. Oakes, I need to speak plain with you," Pete said, his voice gentle but firm. "I am getting too old for this work. My daughter in Helena has been asking me to come stay with her and her family. With Mr. Oakes gone, I think it is time I accepted her invitation." Jessica felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she remained perfectly still. "When would you leave?" "End of the month, if that suits you." "I am sorry, madam, I truly am, but I cannot do the work of 3 men anymore, and that is what this ranch needs." After Pete left, Jessica walked through the house that suddenly felt cavernous and foreign. Thomas's coat still hung by the door. His coffee cup sat unwashed beside the basin. She had been a wife, and now she was a widow. But she had never been simply herself, Jessica, standing alone with nothing but her own will to define her future. The next morning, she rode into Montana City with a list of tasks that seemed insurmountable. She needed to find ranch hands willing to work for a woman. She needed to understand the cattle market. She needed to prove to every doubting face in town that she could survive this. Montana City sprawled along the banks of a tributary that fed into the Missouri River, a collection of wood frame buildings and false front stores that served the ranchers and miners who populated the territory. The town had grown rapidly in the past decade, and with growth came both opportunity and danger. Jessica tied her horse outside the mercantile and stepped into the relative cool of the store, where the proprietor's wife greeted her with exaggerated sympathy. "Oh, my dear Jessica, how are you managing? Such a terrible tragedy. Thomas was such a fine man." Jessica ordered the supplies she needed, ignoring the curiosity in the woman's eyes. As she waited for her items to be gathered, she overheard two ranchers talking near the feed section. "She will not last until autumn," one said, his voice low but not low enough. "A woman running a ranch alone, it is a fool's dream." "Someone will buy the land cheap," the other replied. "Prime grazing territory going to waste because Oakes married a woman who could not even give him a son to inherit it." The words struck like physical blows, but Jessica kept her face composed. She paid for her supplies, loaded them into her wagon, and was preparing to leave when she noticed a man standing outside the saloon across the street. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed by several days of stubble. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, his gun belt well worn but carefully maintained, and he was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and for a moment, the noise of the town seemed to fade. Then a freight wagon rattled between them, and when it passed, the cowboy was walking toward the livery stable, his attention apparently elsewhere. Jessica drove her wagon home, the encounter already fading into the background of her more immediate concerns. She had cattle to manage, fences to mend, and an entire ranch to run with no idea where to start. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the grassland, a rider approached the ranch house. Jessica emerged onto the porch, rifle in hand, because a woman alone could not afford to be careless. The rider stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat, and she recognized him as the cowboy from town. "Madam, my name is Jacob Zimmerman," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I heard in town that you might be looking for a ranch hand." Jessica studied him carefully. "I did not advertise for help." "No, madam, but word travels. Pete mentioned in the saloon that he was leaving, and I have been looking for steady work." Jacob kept his hands visible, his posture unthreatening. "I have been working ranches since I was 14. I know cattle, horses, and fence work. I can provide references if you need them." "Why would you want to work for a woman? The whole town seems to think I am destined to fail." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, an emotion she could not name. "Because I judge a person by their determination, not their circumstances. You could have sold already, could have taken the easy path. The fact that you are still here tells me you are made of stronger material than most." Jessica lowered the rifle slightly. "I cannot pay much. The ranch finances are tight until the autumn cattle sale. Room and board, plus a fair wage once the cattle sell. That would suit me fine." She should have been more cautious, should have asked for those references, should have taken more time to consider. But something in Jacob Zimmerman's steady gaze made her believe he was exactly what he appeared to be, a cowboy looking for honest work. She was also desperate, though she would never have admitted it aloud. "There is a bunkhouse out back. It needs some cleaning, but it is serviceable." You can start tomorrow." Jacob's face broke into a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to something that made Jessica's heart perform an unexpected flutter. "Thank you, madam. You will not regret this." As he rode toward the bunkhouse, leading his pack horse behind him, Jessica wondered if she had just made the wisest or the most foolish decision of her young life. The next morning arrived with the pink and gold light that made Montana territory look like something out of a painting. Jessica woke early, as she always did, and found Jacob already working on the corral fence that Thomas had left unfinished. He worked with efficient, practiced movements, and when he saw her, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Figured I would start with what needed immediate attention," he said. "I checked the herd at dawn. You have got some good stock, but they are scattered too far into the high pasture. We should bring them down closer before we lose any to predators or wandering." Over breakfast, which Jessica insisted he take in the main house despite protocol suggesting ranch hands ate separately, they discussed the work ahead. Jacob spread out a rough map he had drawn of the property boundaries and marked the areas that needed attention. "Your fence line on the eastern border is down in at least 3 places," he explained, his finger tracing the map. "That is where your cattle are drifting. We need to ride out there, make repairs, and drive the stock back to better grazing." "Thomas always meant to fix that section," Jessica said quietly. "He ran out of time." Jacob looked up, and she saw genuine compassion in his brown eyes. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Oakes. It is clear he built something good here." They rode out together that morning, and Jessica discovered that Jacob was not just competent but exceptional at his work. He read the land like other men read books, understanding the flow of water, the patterns of the cattle, the signs of predator activity that she would have missed entirely. He was patient when teaching her things Thomas had never thought to explain, treating her questions with respect rather than condescension. By midday, they had repaired 2 sections of fence and were working on the third when Jacob's horse suddenly shied. He controlled the animal with practiced ease and dismounted, walking carefully toward a cluster of rocks. Jessica watched as he knelt down, examined something, then stood and returned to her with concern etched on his features. "We have got a mountain lion hunting this area," he said, showing her tracks in the soft earth. "Recent, probably last night. We need to get the herd moved today, not tomorrow." They worked through the afternoon heat, driving cattle down from the high pasture to the valley closer to the ranch buildings. It was exhausting work, and Jessica found herself struggling to keep pace. But every time she faltered, Jacob was there, not taking over but supporting, his presence a steady reassurance that she was not alone in this impossible task. When they finally returned to the ranch house, as the sun touched the western mountains, Jessica was covered in dust and sweat, her muscles aching in ways they never had before. Jacob tended the horses while she went inside to wash and prepare dinner. It seemed natural to cook for 2, to set the table with 2 plates instead of eating alone as she had been doing since Thomas's death. Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, they talked about the ranch, about the work still needed, about the upcoming cattle drive to market. But underneath the practical conversation, Jessica felt something else growing, an awareness of Jacob as more than just a hired hand. She noticed the way his hands moved when he talked, the sound of his laugh when she made an observation about the more stubborn cattle, the genuine interest in his eyes when he asked about her plans for the ranch's future. "Why are you not married?" she asked suddenly, then felt her cheeks flush at the forward question. "I apologize, that was inappropriate." Jacob smiled, but there was sadness in it. "No offense taken. I was engaged once 5 years ago. Her name was Sarah. We were planning to marry in the spring, but she got sick that winter. Fever took her in 3 days. He stared at his coffee cup, his voice distant with memory. After that, I just kept moving, never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. Seemed easier that way. I am sorry, Jessica said softly. Loss is a heavy burden to carry. It is, he agreed, meeting her eyes. But it teaches us what matters. Sarah would have wanted me to live fully, not to spend my life running from the possibility of hurt. He paused, then added, "What about you, Mrs. Oakes? What are your plans beyond saving this ranch?" Jessica considered the question, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. "I do not know," she admitted. "I married Thomas when I was 17. He was a good man, a kind man, but I was so young. I thought being a wife and eventually a mother would define my whole life. When the doctors told me I could never have children, it felt like my purpose had been stolen." She looked out the window at the darkening landscape. "Now Thomas is gone, and I am fighting for this ranch not just because it was his, but because I need to prove to myself that I am more than the sum of my failures." "Bearing children is not the measure of a woman's worth," Jacob said firmly, "any more than owning land is the measure of a man's. You are fighting for this ranch because you have courage and determination. Those qualities would make you remarkable regardless of any other circumstances." The words touched something deep inside Jessica, a wounded place she had protected for so long. She blinked back unexpected tears and changed the subject to safer topics. But as Jacob left for the bunkhouse that night, she found herself watching him go with a confusing mix of emotions she was not ready to examine. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. They worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, managing cattle, maintaining buildings and equipment. Jacob proved to be not just skilled but tireless, and Jessica found herself learning more about ranching in 2 weeks than she had in 6 years of marriage. Thomas had loved her but had never thought to include her in the actual running of the ranch. Jacob, by contrast, explained everything, answered every question, and gradually treated her as a partner in the work rather than an employer to be served. They talked while they worked, long conversations that ranged from practical matters to deeper subjects. Jessica learned that Jacob had grown up in Texas, that his father had been a ranch foreman, that he had fought briefly in the last years of the Civil War, despite being barely old enough to hold a rifle. He read books when he could find them, had a surprising knowledge of poetry, and played harmonica in the evenings sometimes, the notes drifting across the prairie like something from another world. Jacob learned that Jessica had been educated at a finishing school in St. Louis before her father's business failures brought the family west. She spoke French, could quote Shakespeare, and had once dreamed of being a teacher before circumstance, and a suitable marriage proposal redirected her life. She confessed that she had never felt adequate as a ranch wife, that Thomas's disappointment in her barrenness had been a constant weight, that she sometimes wondered if his death had secretly relieved him of a burden. "That is grief talking," Jacob said gently when she admitted this one evening as they sat on the porch after a particularly long day. "A man who did not want you would not have built all this. Maybe he was disappointed about children, but that does not mean he regretted you. How can you be sure?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I have known you for 3 weeks, and I can already see that you are the kind of woman a man would be grateful to spend his life beside. If he could not see that, the fault was in him, not you." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that neither seemed ready to address directly. Jessica felt her heart racing and blamed it on exhaustion, though she knew the truth was far more complicated. As July burned toward August, the ranch began to take shape under their combined efforts. The fences were repaired, the cattle were healthy and well managed, and Jessica was gaining confidence in her ability to run the property. But with the progress came a growing awareness of Jacob as more than a ranch hand or even a friend. She noticed the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted fence posts, the sound of his voice in the morning, the feeling of safety that came from his presence. She tried to ignore these feelings, reminding herself that she was a widow in mourning, that respectability demanded a full year of grieving before even considering such thoughts. But the heart, she discovered, did not follow rules of propriety. One afternoon, while they were working together to break a young horse to saddle, the animal suddenly bucked hard. Jacob was thrown, landing with a sickening thud that drove the breath from his lungs. Jessica was off her own horse instantly, running to where he lay gasping in the dirt. "Do not move," she commanded, her hands running over him with urgent care, checking for breaks or serious injury. "Where does it hurt?" "Just knocked the wind out," Jacob managed, though his face was pale. "I will be fine." But when he tried to stand, he winced and nearly fell. Jessica caught him, her arm around his waist, and helped him limp toward the house. He was heavy, solid muscle and bone, and she was acutely aware of the warmth of his body against hers, the masculine scent of him mixed with dust and horse and sweat. She settled him in a chair in the kitchen and carefully examined his ribs, her fingers probing gently through his shirt. He flinched, but did not pull away, and she realized suddenly how intimate this was, how improper, and yet how completely natural it felt to touch him this way. "I think you cracked a rib," she said, forcing herself to focus on the medical assessment rather than the rapid beating of her own heart. "You need to rest for a few days." "We do not have time for rest," Jacob protested. "The cattle need to be moved to the south pasture, and the barn roof needs patching before the autumn rains. The cattle and the barn will still be there in 3 days. You will rest, or you will injure yourself worse." She met his eyes, saw the stubborn set of his jaw, and added more softly, "Please, Jacob, let yourself heal." He subsided, and over the following days Jessica found herself caring for him in ways that blurred every line of propriety. She brought him meals, changed the bandages she had wrapped around his ribs, sat with him in the evenings and read aloud from Thomas's small collection of books. They were playing house, she realized, acting out a domesticity that was not real, that could never be real given who they were and what circumstances dictated. But it felt real when Jacob laughed at her dramatic reading of a particularly purple passage from a dime novel. It felt real when their hands brushed as she handed him a cup of coffee. It felt real when she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch and her skin flush with heat that had nothing to do with the summer temperature. On the third evening, as she sat in the chair beside where he rested on the sofa, Jacob reached out and gently took her hand. The touch was electric, and Jessica knew she should pull away, should maintain the appropriate distance between employer and employee, widow and hired man. Instead, she let her fingers intertwine with his. "Jessica," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time, "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What is it?" "I did not come to your ranch by accident." "I mean, I was looking for work. That part was true. But I saw you in town that day, saw the way you held your head high even though you were surrounded by people who had already written you off as a failure. I watched you load those supplies with your own hands, refusing help from men who offered it only because they wanted to see you struggle. And I thought, there is a woman worth knowing. There is a woman with the kind of strength that matters." Jessica stared at him, unable to form words. He continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "These past weeks have been the best of my life since Sarah died, not just because of the work, but because of you. Your intelligence, your humor, your determination to build something meaningful out of tragedy. I wake up every morning grateful for another day in your presence, and I go to sleep every night wishing I had the right to be more than just your hired hand. Jacob, she whispered, his name a prayer and a plea. I cannot. It has only been 2 months since Thomas died. The town already whispers about me. If they knew that I had feelings for you, if they suspected for even a moment that something improper was happening here, my reputation would be destroyed. And without my reputation, I cannot keep this ranch. No one will do business with a woman they consider immoral. I know, he said, anguish clear in his voice. I know all of that. I am not asking you to do anything about these feelings. I just needed you to know they exist. I needed you to know that if circumstances were different, if the world were not watching and judging, I would court you properly. I would ask permission to call on you, bring you flowers, and tell you every day that you are remarkable. Tears spilled down Jessica's cheeks, and she gripped his hand like a lifeline. If circumstances were different, I would say yes. I would let you court me. I would admit that I think about you constantly, that your smile is the best part of my day, that the thought of you leaving when the cattle are sold terrifies me more than anything else. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the air thick with words unsaid and futures impossible. Finally, Jessica pulled away and stood, wiping her eyes. You should rest. I will check on you in the morning. She fled to her bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it as silent sobs shook her frame. She had not expected to feel this way again, had not expected to want someone with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. And the cruelest part was that wanting was all she could allow herself. Jacob recovered over the following week, and they fell back into their work routine, but everything had changed. The air between them crackled with awareness and restraint. They were scrupulously careful to maintain propriety, never touching, keeping conversations focused on ranch business, aware that any perceived impropriety could destroy the fragile respect Jessica was building in the community. In late August, they drove the cattle to market in Helena, a week-long journey that tested every skill they had developed together. Jessica rode beside Jacob, managing the herd with increasing confidence, and when they sold the stock for a better price than she had dared hope, she felt a surge of triumph that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with proving she could survive. In Helena, as they waited for the bank to process the sale funds, Jacob excused himself and returned an hour later with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" Jessica asked. "A gift, for an exceptional rancher who deserves to celebrate her success." Inside the package was a beautiful leather-bound journal and a silver pen. The journal's cover was embossed with a pattern of prairie flowers, and when Jessica opened it, she found Jacob had written on the first page in surprisingly elegant handwriting. For Jessica Oakes, who proved that strength comes from within, not from circumstances. August 1878. "Jacob, this is too much," she protested, though she clutched the journal to her chest. "It is not enough," he replied quietly, "but it is what I could give without causing gossip." They returned to Montana City with money in the bank and a winter's worth of feed and supplies purchased. The ranch was secure, at least for now, and Jessica had proven to herself and the doubting town that a woman could run a ranch successfully. But the victory felt hollow because she knew that autumn was ending, that winter would soon force them into closer quarters, and that maintaining propriety was becoming harder with each passing day. In September, Margaret visited again, her sharp eyes taking in the repaired ranch, the well-maintained cattle, and most tellingly, The way Jessica and Jacob moved around each other like dancers who knew each other's steps too well. "You have done well," Margaret admitted grudgingly over tea. "I did not think you would make it through the summer." "I had help," Jessica said, nodding toward where Jacob was working on the barn in the distance. Margaret's lips pursed. "Yes, your Cowboy. The town talks about him, you know, about how he lives here on the property. About how often you are seen together. He is my employee. We work together because that is what ranching requires. And you feel nothing for him beyond an employee's wages." Margaret's gaze was penetrating. "I am not blind, Jessica. I see how you look at him, how he looks at you." Jessica set down her teacup with a careful hand. "What I feel is irrelevant. I am a widow in mourning. Nothing inappropriate has occurred and nothing will occur. Jacob is respectful, hardworking, and entirely proper in his conduct. Perhaps. But feelings have a way of becoming visible regardless of conduct. You should be careful. A woman's reputation is fragile, and yours is already compromised by circumstance." After Margaret left, Jessica stood on the porch and watched Jacob work, and she knew her sister-in-law was right. She was falling in love with Jacob Zimmerman, had probably already fallen, and the weight of that love combined with the impossibility of acting on it was crushing her spirit day by day. That evening, as they shared dinner in the kitchen as had become their custom, Jessica made a decision. She set down her fork and looked directly at Jacob. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. "The ranch is stable now. You have fulfilled your contract and more. I can afford to hire another hand for the winter work, someone who can live in town and ride out daily." Jacob's face went carefully blank. "Are you dismissing me? I am giving you the option to leave, to find work elsewhere, to build the life you deserve instead of being trapped here in a situation that cannot lead anywhere." The words hurt to speak, but she forced them out. "You have been wonderful, Jacob. You saved this ranch and probably saved me as well. But I cannot ask you to stay knowing that all we can ever be is employer and employee. You deserve more than stolen glances and restrained conversations." He was quiet for a long moment, and Jessica watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to name. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with feeling. "What if I do not want more than this? What if being near you, even under these constraints, is enough? That is not a life, Jacob. That is a beautiful prison for both of us. And if I choose that prison," he leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. "Jessica, I know what I said weeks ago about wishing circumstances were different. But I have been thinking about it, and I realize that I would rather have you in my life under any conditions than not have you at all. If all we can be is employer and employee, if all we can share is work and meals and conversation, then I will take that. I will take whatever you can give and be grateful for it." "But why?" Jessica felt tears threatening again. "Why would you accept so little?" "Because you are not little," he said fiercely. "You are everything. And if the only way I get to be part of your life is as your ranch hand, then I am your ranch hand. I will keep my feelings locked away. I will never embarrass you or compromise your reputation. But I will not leave unless you order me to go." Jessica closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of what he was offering and what he was asking her to accept. She thought about the long winter ahead, about the years stretching forward, about living in close proximity to a man she loved but could never fully claim. It sounded like torture. It also sounded better than the alternative of losing him entirely. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." Winter arrived with the force of a declaration, howling wind and snow that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Jessica and Jacob worked together to keep the cattle alive and the property maintained, their relationship settling into something that was more than friendship but less than romance, a liminal space that was both painful and precious. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading, talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Jacob kept his promise, never crossing the line from propriety, but his feelings were evident in every glance, every careful gesture, every moment of concern when the work was difficult or dangerous. Jessica found herself cherishing these moments even as they broke her heart a little more each day. She was 23 years old and in love with a man she could never fully have. The mourning period for Thomas would end eventually, but even then, how could she openly court her ranch hand? The social consequences would be severe. A widow marrying so far beneath her perceived station would be seen as proof of weak character or worse. In December, during a particularly fierce blizzard, one of the barn walls partially collapsed under the weight of snow. Jessica and Jacob worked for hours in brutal cold to shore up the structure and protect the horses inside. They were both near exhaustion when the temporary repairs were finally complete, and as they stumbled back to the house, Jacob suddenly pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her to share body heat. "You are freezing," he said, his breath white in the frigid air. "We need to get you warm." Inside, he built up the fire while she changed into dry clothing, and when she emerged, he had coffee heating and blankets warming near the flames. They sat close to the hearth, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, hands cupped around hot mugs, and Jessica felt something shift inside her. "This cannot continue," she said quietly. "Not like this. I am going to go mad living in this half-space between what we are and what we want to be." Jacob looked at her with such longing it was almost painful to witness. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I do not care what the town thinks. I am saying that I have spent too much of my life living according to other people's expectations and rules. I am saying that life is short and unpredictable, and I refuse to waste any more of it pretending I do not love you." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Jacob set down his coffee with trembling hands. "Jessica, you need to be sure. If you choose this, choose me, there will be consequences. Your reputation, your standing in the community, maybe even your ability to maintain the ranch." "I am sure," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I have never been more sure of anything. I love you, Jacob Zimmerman. I love your kindness and your strength and your willingness to see me as a whole person rather than just a failed wife. I love the way you teach me without condescension, the way you laugh at my jokes, the way you play harmonica in the evenings like you are calling to something sacred. I love you, and I am done pretending otherwise." Jacob crossed the small distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his palms. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have loved you since the day I saw you standing in that town with your spine straight and your chin up, refusing to be defeated. You are the bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your love." He kissed her then, and it was like coming home to a place she had never been. Gentle at first, then deeper, filled with months of restrained longing and impossible dreams finally allowed to breathe. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were choosing and what it meant. "I need to tell you something," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "Before we go any further, before we make any plans, you need to know the full truth." "I know about the children," Jacob said gently. "You told me you cannot have them. That does not change anything." "But it should," Jessica insisted, pulling back to look at him fully. "You deserve to have a family, Jacob. You deserve sons and daughters to carry on your name." "I cannot give you that. I have been to 3 different doctors, and they all said the same thing. There is something wrong with me, some fundamental flaw that means I will never carry a child to term. If you marry me, you are accepting a future without children. You need to truly understand what that means." Jacob was quiet for a moment, and Jessica felt her heart constricting with familiar pain. This was the moment when reality would intrude, when he would realize what he was giving up, when the love he professed would prove insufficient against the weight of biological imperative and social expectation. Instead, he took both her hands in his and looked at her with such love it took her breath away. "Then I will love you without condition," he said simply. "Children would have been a blessing, yes, but you are the blessing I choose. I choose you, Jessica. Not some hypothetical future with a different woman and children who do not exist. I choose this life with you, whatever form that takes." The words shattered something inside Jessica that had been broken for years, and she fell into his arms, sobbing against his chest while he held her and murmured reassurances into her hair. For the first time since the doctors had delivered their verdict, she felt like she might be enough just as she was, not despite her inability to bear children but including it as simply one part of who she was. They made love that night in front of the fire, tender and passionate and healing in ways Jessica had not known were possible. Afterward, wrapped in quilts with the storm howling outside, they talked about the future. "We should wait until your mourning period ends before we announce an engagement," Jacob said practically. "That gives us until June. It will not eliminate the gossip, but it will reduce the scandal somewhat. Will you mind waiting that long, keeping this secret? I have waited my whole life to find you. I can wait 6 more months to call you my wife in public." He kissed her forehead. "Though in my heart you are already mine and I am already yours." "Margaret will be furious," Jessica said with a small laugh. "And half the town will claim I have no shame, falling in love with my ranch hand while still wearing mourning clothes. Let them talk. We know the truth of what we are to each other." The winter passed in a blur of work and stolen moments of intimacy. They were careful to maintain appearances when anyone visited, but in the privacy of the ranch, they built a life together that was everything Jessica had never dared to dream. Jacob moved from the bunkhouse to the main house, and they established the rhythms of a married couple even without the legal sanction. In March, Jessica missed her monthly cycle, and hope flared despite everything doctors had told her. But 2 weeks later, she woke with cramping and blood, and the brief dream of impossibility died. She grieved quietly while Jacob held her, not the loss of a child that had never truly been but the resurgence of old pain, the reminder of what she could not provide. "I am sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I know you said it did not matter, but I am still sorry." "Hush," he murmured, stroking her hair. "There is nothing to be sorry for. We have each other. That is more than enough." In April, Jessica received a letter from Thomas's brother in Kansas, inquiring about the ranch and whether she intended to sell. The letter made clear his belief that she would fail without a man to run things properly, and he offered to purchase the property for significantly less than its value. Jessica showed the letter to Jacob, anger burning in her chest. "He thinks I am incompetent," she said. "He thinks the only reason I have survived this long is luck." "Then we will prove him wrong," Jacob said firmly. "This ranch is yours and it will stay yours. And when we marry, it will be ours together, but your name stays on the deed. I want no question about who built this success." They burned the letter together in the stove, watching the presumptuous words turn to ash, and Jessica felt another burden lift from her shoulders. As June approached, they began making quiet plans. They would marry in a simple ceremony in town, no fanfare or elaborate celebration that would seem inappropriate so soon after Thomas's death. They expected censure and gossip, But Jessica discovered that she had moved beyond caring what most people thought. She had proven herself as a rancher, proven she could survive and even thrive under circumstances designed to defeat her. If people chose to judge her for finding love again, that was their failure of compassion, not hers. 2 weeks before the year mark of Thomas's death, Margaret arrived at the ranch unannounced. Jessica and Jacob were working on the corral when her carriage appeared, and they barely had time to assume properly distant positions before she descended with her usual air of disapproval. "Jessica, I need to speak with you, privately." In the house, Margaret wasted no time. "The whole town knows you are sleeping with your ranch hand. They know he has moved into the main house. You are the subject of constant gossip and speculation." "Let them gossip," Jessica said calmly. "I have done nothing I am ashamed of. You are sleeping with an employee. You are a widow who has not even observed a full year of mourning. You are making a mockery of Thomas's memory." "I love Thomas," Jessica said firmly. "But my life did not end with his. I have found someone who loves me truly, who sees me as an equal partner rather than a disappointing wife." "I will not apologize for that, not even to you." Margaret's face was tight with anger. "If you marry this cowboy, you will be ostracized. No respectable family will associate with you. You will be alone. I will have Jacob. That is the opposite of alone. And what about children?" Margaret pressed. "Even if you could have them, do you want to raise children who will be scorned because their mother married beneath her station?" Jessica felt the words like a knife, but she kept her voice steady. "I cannot have children. You know that, so your concern is irrelevant." Margaret's expression shifted, calculation replacing anger. "Actually, that is part of why I came. I have been talking with Dr. Harrison in Helena. He has been studying women's reproductive issues, and he believes previous diagnoses are often incorrect. He has helped several women who were told they were barren successfully bear children. I thought you might want to consult with him." The offer was clearly a manipulation, a last attempt to dissuade Jessica from marrying Jacob by dangling hope for something she had long accepted as impossible. But despite knowing this, Jessica felt a flicker of that dangerous hope. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You have never shown concern for my childlessness before." "Because if you could have children, you might attract a more suitable husband. Someone of proper standing who could help you maintain the ranch's respectability." Jessica almost laughed at the transparent maneuvering. "And if I consulted this doctor and he confirmed what every other doctor has said, would you finally accept my choices? Would you go?" Margaret countered. Jessica thought about it, about Jacob and the life they were building, about whether hope was worth the potential pain of having it crushed again. Finally, she nodded. "I will go. Not because I expect anything different, but because I need to close this door completely. I need to know, one final time, that children are not possible. Then maybe I can move forward without this small voice wondering if we are wrong." She discussed it with Jacob that evening, and he supported her decision. "If you need to do this for your own peace of mind, then we will do it together. But Jessica, please know that nothing the doctor says will change how I feel about you or our future together." In May, they traveled to Helena, and Jessica met with Dr. Harrison, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a straightforward manner. He conducted an examination and asked extensive questions about her medical history, her previous pregnancies that ended in early miscarriage, the assessments other doctors had made. "I cannot guarantee anything," he said finally, "but from what I can determine, you are not barren. You have a condition called a tilted uterus, which can make conception more difficult and increases the risk of early miscarriage. But it is not impossible for you to carry a child, merely challenging. There are techniques, positions, timing methods that can improve your chances. And once pregnant, Bed rest during the first few months can significantly increase the likelihood of carrying to term. Jessica sat frozen in the doctor's office, unable to process what she was hearing. I was told by 3 different doctors that I would never have children. They were wrong. Unfortunately, that happens frequently. Women's reproductive health is still poorly understood by much of the medical profession. He smiled gently. I cannot promise you a child, Mrs. Oakes, but I can tell you that it is possible. Outside the doctor's office, Jessica stood on the Helena Street with Jacob's arm around her waist, and she felt the careful control she had maintained for weeks suddenly crumble. She turned into his embrace and wept, overwhelmed by the implications of what they had just learned. "What if we try and it does not happen?" she asked when she could speak. "What if we get our hopes up and I still cannot give you children?" "Then we will have tried," Jacob said, tipping her face up to look at him. "And we will have each other." "But Jessica, this does not change my proposal or my feelings. I meant what I said. I would love you without condition whether children come or not. If you want to try, we will try. If you do not, we will build a different kind of family. All I need is you." They stayed in Helena that night at a modest hotel, registering as Mr. and Mrs. Zimmerman even though they were not yet married, and made love with a new awareness that this might lead to the child they had both accepted would never exist. It was tender and passionate, and tinged with the bittersweet understanding that hope was as much burden as blessing. On the long ride back to Montana City, they talked about what this meant for their plans. They agreed to move forward with the wedding as scheduled, but with a new dimension of possibility that both excited and terrified Jessica. "What if I do get pregnant?" she asked. "The town will count months. They will assume I was unfaithful to Thomas, or that we were behaving improperly before marriage." "Let them assume," Jacob said. "Their opinions do not change the truth of who we are." They married in the first week of June, a small ceremony at the church with only a few witnesses. Jessica wore a simple dress of pale blue rather than white, and Jacob wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased for the occasion. The minister seemed uncomfortable with the whole affair, clearly aware of the gossip surrounding their relationship, but he performed the ceremony nonetheless. Margaret attended but did not stay for the small reception afterward. As she left, she pulled Jessica aside. "I hope you know what you are doing. You have chosen love over respectability, and that choice will have consequences." "I know exactly what I am doing," Jessica replied. "For the first time in my life, I am choosing something holy for myself, not because it is expected or appropriate, but because it is what my heart demands." Their wedding night was spent in their own bed at the ranch. They now officially owned together, though Jessica had insisted her name remain on the deed as primary owner with Jacob as her legal partner. They made love as husband and wife, and Jessica felt a completeness she had never experienced before. Over the following months, they worked the ranch together, now openly as a married couple. The town gossip was vicious at first. Whispers about the widow who could not wait a proper mourning period. Speculation about whether she was pregnant and had married in haste to cover impropriety. But gradually, as weeks turned to months and Jessica showed no signs of pregnancy, the gossip faded to background noise. They had proven the ranch could thrive, had demonstrated that their partnership was genuine and effective, and eventually, even the most critical voices had to acknowledge that the Zimmermans knew what they were doing. In September, Jessica missed her cycle again. This time, she said nothing to Jacob, refusing to raise hopes that might be crushed. But when 2 months passed and the nausea began, she could no longer deny the possibility. They traveled back to Helena to see Dr. Harrison, and when he confirmed the pregnancy, Jessica felt terror and joy in equal measure. "You need to be very careful," the doctor warned. "Complete bed rest for the first 4 months at minimum. No heavy lifting, no extended time on horseback, no stress that can be avoided. Even with precautions, the risk of miscarriage is significant given your condition." The ride home was quiet, both of them processing what this meant. Jessica would be incapacitated for months during their busiest season. Jacob would have to manage the ranch alone while also caring for her, and even with all precautions, there was no guarantee the pregnancy would last. "We will make it work," Jacob said firmly when she voiced these concerns. "I will hire temporary help for the ranch work. You will rest and focus on keeping our baby safe. We will do whatever it takes." The next months were the longest of Jessica's life. Confined to bed, she could only watch through the window as Jacob and the 2 hands he hired managed the autumn cattle drive and prepared the ranch for winter. She fretted constantly, worried about every twinge and cramp, convinced that each day might be the one when she would lose this precious chance at motherhood. Jacob was endlessly patient, bringing her meals, reading to her in the evenings, holding her when fear overwhelmed her ability to stay calm. In December, as the first snows fell, Dr. Harrison came to the ranch to check on her progress. "The baby is strong," he said, pressing his stethoscope to her swollen belly. "The heartbeat is steady. If you can make it through the next month, your chances of carrying to term increase dramatically." Jessica cried with relief, and Jacob held her hand so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Their daughter was born on a brilliant March morning in 1879, her first cries filling the ranch house with a sound Jessica had never dared to dream she would hear. Jacob wept openly as Dr. Harrison placed the infant in Jessica's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her child and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the universe. "We are naming her Sarah," Jessica said, looking at Jacob through her tears. "After the woman who taught you how to love." Jacob kissed her forehead, his tears falling onto her hair. "Sarah Zimmerman. It is perfect." The town's reaction to the birth was mixed. Some saw it as proof that Jessica's marriage to Jacob was blessed despite its unconventional nature. Others counted months and whispered about impropriety, though the dates made clear the baby had been conceived after their marriage. Jessica discovered she did not care either way. She had her daughter, her husband, and her ranch, and the opinions of people who had doubted her were irrelevant. Sarah was a healthy baby, demanding and vocal and beautiful in the way all infants are to their parents. Jacob was a devoted father, walking the floor with her at night when she fussed, singing to her in his rough voice, looking at her with such wonder that Jessica fell in love with him all over again watching him hold their daughter. In June, as spring turned to summer and Sarah approached 3 months old, Margaret visited the ranch for the first time since the wedding. She held her grandniece awkwardly, her expression unreadable, and finally looked at Jessica with something that might have been respect. "You proved me wrong," she said simply. "About the ranch, about Jacob, about everything. I did not think you had this in you, but I am glad I was mistaken." "Thank you," Jessica said, accepting the olive branch for what it was. After Margaret left, Jessica stood on the porch with Sarah in her arms and looked out over the land she and Jacob had built together. The ranch was thriving, the cattle were healthy, and their home was filled with love and the bright promise of family. She thought about the girl she had been at 17, marrying Thomas Oakes with romantic dreams and no real understanding of what life would demand. She thought about the broken woman she had been at 23, standing at her husband's grave and believing her life was effectively over. Jacob came up behind her and wrapped his arms around both of them, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about how grateful I am that my first life ended when Thomas died, because it made room for this life, this love, this family." She turned to look at him, this man who had chosen her without condition, who had proven that love was not about what you could provide but about who you chose to be together. "Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself. Thank you for teaching me that barren does not mean empty, that loss does not mean ending, that sometimes the best things come from the courage to start over." "Thank you for letting me love you," Jacob replied, kissing her softly. "For taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but a horse and a prayer. For building this life with me." Sarah made a small noise and they both laughed, the moment broken and reformed around the everyday miracle of their daughter. They went inside together, and Jessica realized that happiness was not the absence of struggle or the fulfillment of every dream but the presence of love that persisted through both. She had been told she was barren, and Jacob had loved her without condition. That love had proven to be the most fertile ground possible, growing a family, a home, and a future that exceeded anything she could have imagined. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and difficult cattle seasons, periods when money was tight and the work seemed endless. In 1881, Jessica became pregnant again, and despite her previous success, the pregnancy ended in miscarriage at 3 months. They grieved together, but the grief was bearable because they had Sarah and each other, because one child was a miracle they had never expected to receive. They did not try again after that. Dr. Harrison advised that another pregnancy might pose serious risks to Jessica's health, and both agreed that their family was complete as it was. Sarah grew into a bright, spirited child who loved the ranch as much as her parents did, who could ride almost before she could walk, who asked endless questions about cattle and horses and the wide Montana sky. In 1885, when Sarah was 6, they hosted a gathering at the ranch for the first time, inviting neighboring ranchers and their families. It was an acknowledgement that the Zimmerman ranch had become an established, respected part of the community, that the scandal of their marriage had faded into history. Pete, the old ranch hand who had left years before, came from Helena with his daughter's family, and he and Jacob spent the evening trading stories and laughter. Margaret attended with her own grandchildren, and as Jessica watched her sister-in-law playing with Sarah, she felt the last vestiges of old pain dissolve. She had built something good from the ashes of her first marriage, had created a legacy that had nothing to do with meeting other people's expectations, and everything to do with following her own heart. That night, after the guests had left and Sarah was asleep in her small room, Jessica and Jacob sat on the porch as they had countless times before. The stars were brilliant in the clear Montana sky, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. "You ever regret it?" Jessica asked quietly. "Choosing this life, choosing me." Jacob took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar path across her knuckles. "Not for a single moment. You are my greatest adventure, Jessica Zimmerman. You and Sarah and this ranch we built together. This is the life I was meant to live." "I love you," she said, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond if such things are possible." "Then I will love you without condition," he replied, echoing the words that had become their vow, their promise, their truth. "Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows we are blessed to share." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting from faith, work, and love that refused to be bound by circumstances or expectations. The ranch spread out before them, a testament to what could be accomplished when two hearts chose each other without reservation or condition. And in the quiet of that Montana evening, surrounded by the land they loved and the family they had created, Jessica knew she had found exactly what she had been searching for without knowing it existed. A home not just in a place but in another person, a love that asked nothing but gave everything, and a future built on the simple, revolutionary choice to love without condition. Sarah grew up strong and capable, absorbing both her mother's determination and her father's steady wisdom. She attended school in Montana City when weather permitted, and Jessica taught her at home when it did not, ensuring her daughter had the education Jessica herself had valued. Jacob taught her ranching from the time she could sit on a horse, and by the time she was 10, Sarah could manage cattle, mend fences, and handle the day-to-day operations of the ranch with surprising competence. In 1888, when Sarah was 9, a young cowboy named Timothy Foster came looking for work. He was barely 20, green but eager, and reminded Jessica and Jacob so much of themselves when they first met that they hired him on the spot. Timothy proved to be a hard worker and quickly became almost part of the family, eating meals with them and entertaining Sarah with stories of his travels through the West. As the years passed, the ranch continued to prosper. Jacob and Jessica made smart decisions about breeding stock, expanded their grazing land through a careful purchase of adjacent property, and became known throughout Montana Territory for the quality of their cattle. The scandal of their marriage became ancient history, replaced by respect for what they had built together. In 1889, Montana achieved statehood, and Jessica and Jacob attended the celebration in Helena with Sarah. Standing in the crowd as the new state flag was raised, Jessica reflected on how much had changed since that terrible June day in 1878 when Thomas had died. She had been 23 then, broken and lost. Now, at 34, she was a successful rancher, a devoted wife, a loving mother, and a woman who had learned that strength came not from meeting others' expectations, but from having the courage to define her own path. That evening, in their hotel room while Sarah slept in the adjoining space, Jacob pulled Jessica close and said, "Do you know what today made me think about?" "What?" "That we built our life during territorial days and now we are seeing it continue into statehood. We are part of Montana's history now, part of what makes this place what it is. You, me, Sarah, the ranch. We matter." Jessica kissed him, this man who had chosen her when she thought herself unchosen, who had loved her when she believed herself unlovable. We matter because we chose each other. Everything else grew from that. As Sarah entered her teenage years, she began to show interest in expanding the ranch's operations beyond cattle. She had been reading about sheep ranching and thought the high pastures might support a flock. Jessica and Jacob listened to her proposals, impressed by her research and reasoning, and eventually agreed to let her try on a small scale. It was another investment in their daughter's future, another way of showing her that her ideas and dreams mattered. In 1895, Sarah turned 16, and young men from neighboring ranches suddenly found reasons to visit more frequently. Jessica watched her daughter navigating these attentions with amusement and recognition, remembering her own youth and the paths not taken. She and Jacob had agreed they would let Sarah choose her own way, whether that meant marrying young like Jessica had, or pursuing education in the East, or anything else she desired. But Sarah's heart was in the land, and when she was 18, she announced her intention to marry Timothy Foster, who had worked on the ranch for nearly a decade and had proven himself capable, kind, and devoted. The wedding in 1897 was everything Jessica's own second wedding had not been. Large, celebratory, filled with friends and neighbors who had watched Sarah grow up. Jessica wept through the entire ceremony, and Jacob held her hand and whispered, "Our daughter has chosen well. She chose with her heart, like her mother." Timothy and Sarah built a small house on the far edge of the ranch property, and the young couple began managing the sheep operation that had grown from Sarah's teenage experiment into a profitable enterprise. Jessica watched her daughter navigate early marriage with more wisdom than she herself had possessed at that age, and she was grateful that Sarah had both parents to turn to for advice and support. In 1898, Sarah gave birth to twin boys, and Jacob became a grandfather at 43. He was completely besotted with the infants, carrying them around the ranch and introducing them to horses and cattle before they could even hold up their heads. Jessica watched him with their grandsons and fell in love with him all over again. This man who had proven that family was not just about blood, but about choice and love and commitment. As the new century approached, Jessica found herself reflecting on the 20 years since Thomas's death, the years that had transformed her from a desperate widow into a woman of substance and accomplishment. She had saved a ranch, built a marriage based on genuine partnership, raised a daughter who knew her own worth, and created a legacy that would extend beyond her own life. On New Year's Eve 1899, as the 19th century prepared to yield to the 20th, the entire extended family gathered at the ranch house. Sarah and Timothy were there with the twins, now toddling and getting into everything. Pete had passed away the previous year, but his daughter and grandchildren came from Helena. Margaret was there with her family, reconciled fully with Jessica after years of gradual acceptance. Neighbors and friends filled the house to capacity, celebrating not just the turn of the century, but the community they had built together. As midnight approached, Jacob found Jessica standing on the porch, looking out at the land silvered by moonlight. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in the cold Montana air. 21 years, she said softly, since we met, since you came to my ranch looking for work. Best decision I ever made, he replied, his breath warm against her ear. Do you remember what you said to me? When I told you I was barren, I remember every word of every important conversation we have ever had. I said I would love you without condition. Jessica turned in his arms to face him, studying the face that had become more precious to her than her own. There were lines there now that had not been present at 28, strands of gray in the dark hair, but he was still the man who had seen her truly and chosen her wholly. You kept that promise, she said, reaching up to touch his cheek. Every single day you have kept that promise. Through the hard times and the good times, through loss and success, through everything that life has brought us. You loved me without condition, and that love saved me, Jacob. It saved me and made me who I am. You saved yourself, he corrected gently. I just had the privilege of being there to witness it and support it. You are the bravest person I have ever known, Jessica. You took a life that seemed to offer nothing but grief and limitation, and you turned it into something beautiful. You did that. Inside the house, someone began counting down to midnight. Jessica and Jacob stood on the porch holding each other as voices rose in unison. 10, 9, 8. I love you, Jessica said. 7, 6, 5. I love you, Jacob replied. 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. The cry rose from inside the house, and church bells began ringing in the distance, celebrating the arrival of 1900. Jacob kissed Jessica as the new century was born, and she thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. Loss and love, despair and hope, endings and beginnings. They went inside to join the celebration, and Jessica found herself surrounded by family and friends, by the life she and Jacob had built from nothing but determination and love. Sarah raised a glass in toast, the twins asleep in a bedroom upstairs, Timothy at her side looking at her with devotion that reminded Jessica of how Jacob looked at her. "To my parents," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the crowded room, "who taught me that strength means choosing your own path, that love means accepting people as they are, and that family is what you build together. Thank you for showing me how to live with courage and heart." Jessica felt tears streaming down her face, and Jacob's arm tightened around her waist. She looked around the room at these people who had become her community, her family, her home, and she realized that the story that had begun with a gunshot echoing through a canyon had become a story about resilience, redemption, and the transformative power of love given without conditions or reservations. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch continued to thrive, passing into Sarah and Timothy's capable management as Jessica and Jacob gradually stepped back from the daily operations. They remained active and involved, but they also took time to travel, to visit places they had only read about, to enjoy the fruits of decades of hard work. In 1905, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, and Jessica held her granddaughter and marveled at the circle of life, at how this tiny infant was a living testament to love that had refused to accept limitations. They named the baby Jessica, and the elder Jessica wept at the honor, at the understanding that her story would continue through generations she would never meet. As Jessica entered her 50s, her hair silver and her hands marked by years of work, she and Jacob would sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun set over the Montana mountains. They were comfortable together in the way of people who had shared decades of life, who knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken, who had weathered every storm as a united front. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" Jessica asked one evening in 1908. "If you had not come to the ranch that day, if I had sold like everyone expected me to." "I try not to," Jacob admitted, "because thinking about a world where I did not have you is like thinking about a world without air or light. It is incomprehensible." "I was so broken when you met me," Jessica said softly. "I believed I had nothing to offer. You had everything to offer, you just could not see it yet." He took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after 3 decades together. "But I saw it. I saw a woman who refused to be defeated, who stood up when the world expected her to fall down. I saw strength and beauty and a spirit that could not be crushed. I saw the woman I wanted to spend my life loving." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear Sarah and Timothy talking with the children, the sounds of family that filled the spaces between heartbeats. "I am so grateful," Jessica whispered, "for all of it. For you, for Sarah, for this life we built together. Even for the hard parts, because they taught me what mattered." "I am grateful too," Jacob replied. "Every day I wake up grateful that I get to love you. That has not changed in 30 years, and it will not change for however many years we have left." As they grew older, Jessica and Jacob became respected elders in the Montana City community. Young couples would seek their advice, asking how they had built such a successful marriage and partnership. Jessica always gave the same answer: "Choose someone who loves you for who you are, not who they want you to become, and then work every day to be worthy of that love." In 1915, as World War I raged in Europe and the world seemed to be changing at an incomprehensible pace, Jessica celebrated her 60th birthday surrounded by 3 generations of family. Sarah was 42 now, a successful rancher in her own right. The twins were 17, strong young men preparing to take their place in the world. Young Jessica was 10, bright and curious, and showing every sign of inheriting her grandmother's determination. Jacob, at 60, was still active on the ranch, though he moved more carefully now and took more time to rest. He and Jessica had become the story that people told to illustrate that love could overcome any obstacle, that choosing each other was the beginning of everything meaningful. That night, after the celebration had ended and they were alone in their bedroom, Jacob held Jessica close and said, "Thank you for 60 years of loving me." "I have only loved you for 37 years, Jessica corrected with a laugh. "I am counting ahead," he replied. Planning for the future. They made love slowly, tenderly, in the way of people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own, who found intimacy in gentleness rather than passion. Afterward, Jessica lay with her head on Jacob's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, the rhythm that had been her anchor for nearly 4 decades. "You remember what you said to me the night we first admitted we loved each other?" she asked. "The night of the blizzard when we stopped pretending. I said many things that night. You said I was brave, that I was the bravest person you had ever known." Jessica raised her head to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "But I was only brave because you made me feel safe enough to be brave. You loved me without judgment, without conditions, without expectations that I could not meet. You gave me the freedom to become who I was meant to be." "We did that for each other," Jacob said, cupping her face in his weathered hand. "Love is not about one person saving another. It is about 2 people choosing to walk through life together, supporting each other, believing in each other, refusing to give up even when things are hard." "That is what we did, Jessica. We chose each other and we kept choosing each other every single day." Jessica kissed him, this man who had been her partner in every sense of the word, and she knew that whatever time they had left, they would spend it as they had spent the past 37 years. Together, loving each other without condition, building something that would last long after they were gone. The ranch became a legacy, passing through generations marked by the values Jessica and Jacob had established. Work hard, treat people fairly, love without reservation, and never accept other people's limitations as your own truth. These principles became the foundation not just of a successful ranch, but of a family that understood its own worth. As Jessica entered her 70s, her health began to decline gradually. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of years and hard work taking their inevitable toll. Jacob cared for her with the same devotion he had shown for over 4 decades, and she let him, understanding finally that accepting help was not weakness but wisdom. In the spring of 1923, as Jessica lay in bed recovering from a bout of pneumonia, Sarah brought young Jessica, now 18, to visit. The young woman sat beside her grandmother's bed and held her hand. "Tell me the story again, Grandma," she asked, "about how you and Grandpa fell in love." Jessica looked at her granddaughter's eager face and smiled. "Your grandfather came to my ranch when I was a widow who believed her life was over. I had lost my husband, I could not have children, and the whole world expected me to fail. But your grandfather looked at me and saw not my failures but my possibilities. He worked beside me, taught me, believed in me when I did not believe in myself. And when I finally told him the truth about why I could not give him children, do you know what he said?" "What did he say?" young Jessica asked, though she had heard this story many times. "He said, 'Then I will love you without condition,' and he meant it. For 45 years he has kept that promise. He loved me through everything, and that love made everything else possible. Your mother, this ranch, the family you are part of, all of it grew from that love." Young Jessica squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I want to find that kind of love someday." "You will," Jessica assured her. "Not because you search for it, but because you become the kind of person who deserves it. Be brave, be honest, be willing to work hard for what matters. The rest will follow." Jacob came into the room then, carrying tea, and his face lit up when he saw Jessica awake and talking. Even at 73, even after 45 years, his love for her was written plainly on his features for anyone to see. Jessica recovered from the pneumonia, and they had 2 more good years together. Years of watching the ranch prosper under Sarah and Timothy's management, of playing with great-grandchildren, of sitting together on the porch and remembering everything they had been through and built together. In the autumn of 1925, Jacob died peacefully in his sleep. Jessica held in his arms as he had held her for nearly half a century. He was 75 years old, and he left behind a legacy of love, hard work, and proof that the best things in life came from choosing with your heart rather than your head. Jessica grieved deeply, but not desperately. She had loved Jacob Zimmerman for 47 years, had built a life with him that exceeded every dream, had been loved by him without condition or reservation. That love did not end with his death. It lived on in their daughter, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and in the ranch that stood as a testament to what 2 people could create when they refused to accept the world's limitations. She lived 3 more years, active and engaged despite her grief. She taught young Jessica everything she knew about ranching, about love, about choosing courage over comfort. And on a bright morning in May 1928, Jessica Zimmerman died at 73 years old, surrounded by family in the ranch house she and Jacob had made into a home. They buried her next to Jacob on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the entire Montana City community came to pay their respects to a woman who had proven that strength came in many forms. Sarah stood at the graveside with Timothy beside her, their children and grandchildren arrayed around them, and she told the story one final time. My mother was told she was barren, that she could never have children, that her value as a woman was somehow diminished by this fact. My father looked at her and said, "Then I will love you without condition. That love created me, even though the doctors said it was impossible. That love built this ranch, this family, this legacy. And that love proved that the greatest things in life come not from meeting other people's expectations, but from 2 people choosing each other completely, without reservation, and building something beautiful together." The ranch continued for generations after Jessica and Jacob were gone, passing to their great-grandchildren and beyond. But it was always known as the place where Jessica Oakes had refused to accept defeat, where Jacob Zimmerman had proven that true love required no conditions, and where 2 people had built something lasting from nothing more than determination, faith, and love given freely without limitation or expectation. And on quiet evenings, when the Montana wind whispered through the grass and the stars blazed overhead in that vast western sky, people swore they could still feel that love, woven into the very fabric of the land, a testament to what was possible when 2 hearts chose each other and refused to let anything, not grief, not circumstance, not even the impossible, stand in the way of the life they were meant to build together. The story of Jessica and Jacob Zimmerman became the story that mothers told daughters, that fathers told sons, that young lovers whispered to each other when making promises about forever. It was proof that love without condition was not just possible but essential, that the greatest adventures came from having the courage to choose your own path, and that sometimes the most broken beginnings led to the most beautiful endings. And in the end, that was the legacy they left behind. Not just land or wealth or even descendants, but proof that love, real, true, unconditional love, could transform everything it touched, could build cathedrals from ruins, could create life from barrenness, and could turn 2 lost souls into something eternal, something that would echo through generations long after the last person who knew them personally had turned to dust. They had loved each other without condition, and that love had proven to be the most fertile ground of all, growing a family, a home, a legacy, and a story that would be told as long as people still believed in the transformative power of choosing love over fear, courage over comfort, and partnership over pride. The widow had been barren. The cowboy had loved her anyway, and together they had built something that proved love was never limited by what we could not do, but was instead defined by what we chose to create together. One day, one decision, one unconditional commitment at a time.